During the depths of the Eastern Front's most savage fighting, one battle consumed more Soviet lives than Stalingrad, yet was deliberately erased from history for decades. The Rzhev meat grinder, as veterans called it, pitted one of Germany's most brilliant defensive commanders against the full weight of Soviet military power across 14 months of relentless slaughter. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers became casualties attempting to crack a single German salient, and when it finally ended, the man responsible for defending it simply walked away. This is the story of how Field Marshal Walter Model held an impossible position against everything the Red Army could throw at him, and why the Soviet Union buried the truth for 50 years. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, weapons, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. In January 1942, the Wehrmacht clung to a massive bulge in the front line, roughly 150 kilometers west of Moscow. This was the Rzhev Salient, a dagger pointed directly at the Soviet capital, left behind after the failed German drive on Moscow the previous winter. Soviet High Command viewed this salient as an existential threat. As long as German forces held Rzhev, a renewed offensive toward Moscow remained possible. Stalin demanded its elimination. The man tasked with holding this salient was Walter Model, who assumed command of the German Ninth Army in January 1942. Model was not a typical Wehrmacht general. He came from a middle-class background rather than Prussian aristocracy, spoke bluntly to superiors including Hitler himself, and earned a reputation as a relentless hands-on commander who appeared at the most dangerous points of the front line. His soldiers called him the Führer's fireman because he was repeatedly sent to stabilize crumbling sectors. At Rzhev, he would earn that title many times over. The salient itself stretched roughly 100 kilometers wide and 40 kilometers deep, a landscape of forests, frozen rivers, and scattered villages connected by dirt roads that turned to mud in spring and froze solid in winter. Model organized his defenses in depth, constructing elaborate trench systems, bunker networks, and interlocking fields of fire. He understood that holding this position meant absorbing punishment that would break most formations, and he prepared accordingly. The Soviets launched their first major attempt to destroy the salient in January 1942 as part of the broader winter counteroffensive that had pushed the Wehrmacht back from Moscow. Forces from the Kalinin and Western fronts struck from multiple directions, attempting to pinch off the salient at its base. The fighting was extraordinarily brutal. Soviet infantry advanced through waist-deep snow in temperatures reaching -30 degrees Celsius, attacking positions where German defenders had constructed fortified strongpoints in every village and tree line. Model's defense relied on aggressive counterattacks at every penetration point. Rather than passively absorbing blows, he organized rapid battle groups combining infantry, assault guns, and whatever armor was available, striking at the flanks of every Soviet breakthrough. When Soviet forces punched through one sector, Model would seal the breach before it could be exploited, then shift his reserves to meet the next threat. His energy was extraordinary. Staff officers reported he slept no more than 3 or 4 hours nightly, constantly moving between command posts and forward positions. The spring and summer of 1942 brought no relief. Soviet forces launched repeated offensives against the salient in what became a grinding cycle of attack, repulse, brief pause, then renewed attack. The first Battle of Rzhev in January through April was followed by further assaults through the summer months. Each offensive followed a similar pattern. Massive artillery preparation would precede waves of Soviet infantry and armor. German defenders would absorb the initial blow, then counterattack to restore positions. Casualties on both sides mounted steadily, but Soviet losses consistently dwarfed German ones due to the attackers' disadvantage against prepared defenses. The human cost was staggering even by Eastern Front standards. Soviet veteran Pyotr Mikhin, who fought at Rzhev and later published his memoirs, described the battlefield as a conveyor belt of death. Fresh divisions would arrive, be fed into the attack, suffer devastating casualties within days, then be replaced by the next formation. Mikhin described crossing fields covered with frozen Soviet dead, stacked in rows, bodies that could not be buried because the ground was frozen solid and enemy fire made retrieval suicidal. He wrote that new replacements arriving at the front would see these fields and understand immediately what awaited them. German accounts paint an equally grim picture. The defensive positions around Rzhev became known within the Wehrmacht as a series of small fortresses connected by trenches filled with ice water in spring and frozen mud in winter. German soldiers endured constant Soviet probing attacks, sniper fire, and artillery bombardment that never truly ceased. Resupply was difficult across the limited road network, and units frequently fought while short on ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Frostbite casualties during winter months rivaled combat losses. The most ambitious Soviet attempt to eliminate the salient came in November 1942 with Operation Mars, personally planned and overseen by Marshal Zhukov. This was conceived as a twin offensive alongside Operation Uranus at Stalingrad. While Uranus aimed to encircle Paulus's 6th Army in the south, Mars was supposed to destroy Model's 9th Army in the center. Zhukov assembled enormous forces for the operation, including nearly 700,000 troops, over 1,000 tanks, and thousands of artillery pieces drawn from the Kalinin and Western fronts. Operation Mars launched on November 25, 1942. Soviet forces attacked from multiple directions simultaneously, aiming to sever the salient at its neck near Rzhev and Sychevka. Initial penetrations achieved some success, with Soviet armor breaking through German lines in several sectors, but Model had anticipated the offensive. His intelligence staff had detected Soviet concentrations, and he positioned his reserves to respond rapidly to the most dangerous breakthroughs. What followed over the next 3 weeks was a catastrophe for the Red Army. Model's counterattacks isolated and destroyed Soviet units that had penetrated his lines. At Luchesa Valley, an entire Soviet mechanized corps was surrounded and annihilated after breaking through German positions but outrunning its infantry support. Near Belai, the Soviet 41st Army achieved a deep penetration only to find itself trapped in a pocket when German forces closed behind it. Brutal fighting at close quarters continued for days as surrounded Soviet troops attempted to break out while Model's forces tightened the encirclement. Zhukov committed his reserves piecemeal, feeding fresh units into attacks that had already lost momentum. Each new assault achieved less than the one before, as German defenders, fighting from prepared positions, extracted a devastating toll. Soviet tank losses were particularly severe, armored formations advancing across open ground toward fortified positions were engaged by German anti-tank guns, assault guns, and mines that destroyed vehicles in enormous numbers. Burnt-out Soviet tanks dotted the landscape around every German strongpoint. By mid-December, Operation Mars had conclusively failed. Soviet casualties reached approximately 335,000, killed, wounded, and missing, with over 1,700 tanks destroyed. It represented Zhukov's greatest defeat, a fact the Soviet Union went to extraordinary lengths to conceal. For decades after the war, Operation Mars was either omitted entirely from Soviet histories or mentioned only as a diversionary operation supporting the Stalingrad encirclement. It was not until American historian David Glantz published his study of the battle in 1999 that the full scope of the disaster became widely known in the West. Model's defense during Operation Mars cemented his reputation as the Wehrmacht's premier defensive specialist. He had held his positions against overwhelming numerical superiority through a combination of intelligence preparation, aggressive counterattack doctrine, elastic defense, and sheer personal willpower that kept his exhausted troops fighting. Hitler rewarded him with the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross and increasingly turned to him whenever a crisis demanded stabilization. Yet the grinding continued into early 1943. Soviet forces maintained pressure on the salient even after Mars failed, launching smaller but persistent attacks that continued bleeding both sides. By February 1943, the strategic situation had changed dramatically. The German surrender at Stalingrad freed massive Soviet reserves, and the Rzhev salient, while successfully defended, consumed German divisions desperately needed elsewhere. Holding it no longer made strategic sense. In March 1943, the Wehrmacht executed Operation Buffalo, a carefully planned withdrawal from the Rzhev Salient. Model orchestrated the evacuation with characteristic precision, pulling his forces back to a shortened defensive line while demolishing infrastructure and laying extensive minefields to slow pursuit. Soviet forces, initially unaware the withdrawal was underway, occupied abandoned positions and declared victory. The propaganda machinery celebrated the liberation of Rzhev as a great triumph, conveniently omitting the 14 months of failed offensives and catastrophic casualties that preceded it. The total human cost of the Rzhev battles remains difficult to calculate precisely because Soviet records were deliberately obscured and German records were incomplete. Modern estimates suggest total Soviet casualties across all Rzhev operations exceeded 1 million, including over 300,000 killed. German losses, while significantly lower, were still substantial, estimated between 300,000 and 400,000 total casualties. These numbers made the Rzhev Salient one of the single bloodiest sectors of the entire Eastern Front, consuming more lives per square kilometer than almost any other sustained engagement of the war. The deliberate Soviet suppression of the Rzhev battles created a generational wound. Families of soldiers killed, they were told their loved ones died in unnamed operations, or simply listed as missing. Veterans who survived found their experiences written out of official histories. The poet, Alexander Tvardovsky, captured this erasure in his famous 1946 poem titled I Was Killed Near Rzhev, giving voice to the forgotten dead who asked only to be remembered. For decades, this poem was one of the few public acknowledgments that the battles had occurred at all. Model would go on to command in further defensive battles, eventually receiving command of Army Group B in the west, where he faced the Allied advance after D-Day. Cornered in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, he dissolved his army group to spare his youngest soldiers from further fighting, then shot himself in a forest rather than surrender. He never wrote memoirs and left no extensive personal papers, making the Rzhev defense one of the best examples of his methods preserved primarily through operational records and the accounts of those who served under him. The Rzhev meat grinder stands as one of the most important yet least remembered chapters of the Second World War. It demonstrated that even overwhelming numerical superiority could be defeated by skillful defense, that the Soviet military machine was capable of absorbing staggering losses and continuing to fight, and that political narratives could bury the truth of 1 million casualties for half a century. The frozen fields around Rzhev, where so many thousands remain buried in unmarked graves, serve as testament to the cost of a battle the world was encouraged to forget. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more hidden chapters of history explored every week. Thank you for watching.